Okay, Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Amen. Where do we find God? Where do we find him? We find God in his word. We find him most clearly revealed in his word. And that means because his word is filled with so many stories, we find God in stories. That doesn't mean we find him like we might find a fictional character in a story. We find him in the history of his dealings with his people, the way that he has dealt with, the way that he has met with his people. In those stories, we learn what God is like. We learn about his character. We learn about his purposes. We learn about his plan. And then we begin to find out who we are. When we begin to see who God is and what he is all about, we begin to find ourselves in that story. We find ourselves, our true selves, in relation to him. Do we belong to him, or are we separated from him? Some people were using that sort of idea, that sort of thinking, weren't they, as they thought a little bit about the Queen and her death. People were sort of finding themselves, or at least linking their identity to the Queen and her reign. She was our sovereign, and we've come to pay our respect as her subjects. Some people said that she was the grandmother of the nation, and so they came like her grandchildren to pay their respects at her funeral. Some would say something like, she was all that was good about this nation, so we're trying to line ourselves up as citizens of this nation, as ones who live in the light of her life. These stories that we find about God in the Bible give our lives meaning and purpose. They give us direction. They help us to find ourselves in this world, to find our way in this world, which can often be difficult and challenging. They can help us decide what we should do, who we're supposed to be. And this book of Exodus is a book of drama and excitement. Books that all of us know well, the key stories of this book that we know well. But as I was just hinting at earlier in the service, it doesn't really start with a bang. It starts with a groan. It starts with a series of hardships and struggling and suffering and grief and pain. It begins with a world that we can identify with, a world that is hurting, a world that seems bare, lacking hope. If life seems heavy, if it seems like there's a fight for survival going on, then that relates easily to Exodus chapter 1. To make matters worse, in that groaning misery, in that sadness, God is surprisingly silent. God seems distant and far away from the page. God seems to have left the people, his people, alone. And they suffer. Some big questions for us to think about this morning. Questions like, who am I to this God? The God who is going to come out of this chapter 1. Who am I to him? How do I relate to him? Am I one of his people? The center of this chapter are God's chosen people, the people who he loves, the people who he's called, the people who he's named. Well, one question to be asking yourself, is that me? Do I belong to God? Am I one of this number? Questions. First heading, an ancient people. Exodus is a new story. It's a story, a book in and of its own, but it's not brand new. It's a book that continues. It's linked to the story before, a bit like the Harry Potter series of books or the Narnia series of books. You can read them independently if you want. You can pick up Prince Caspian, or you can pick up, I'm struggling now, The Goblet of Fire. You can pick up one of those books out of the series, out of the sequence, and read it and enjoy it. But really, what you want to be doing is be reading in series, in sequence, reading from start to finish to give you that full picture. And Exodus is a continuation. It's an exciting book. It's a dramatic book. It's a book in and of itself. You can pick it up and read it from page number 1. But also, to perhaps get a fuller understanding of what's going on, we need to see it as a continuation of what went before. There's a couple of hints to that Moses has that in mind as he's even writing the book. Some links, some ways in which the first chapter of Exodus looks back to Genesis and says, don't forget that first book. The first hint is the first word, which isn't very helpful in English because it's not translated. The first word is and in Hebrew. We don't have it there in our English translations. And so there's an and. That's the start, the first letter of the book. It tells us that it's continuing the story from where Moses left off there in Genesis. The same God, the same people, Israel, that God is dealing with. The same promises that he's made to them are being fulfilled. The same purposes. And just to make sure that we tie it in with Genesis, the book that came before, we're giving a recap right at the beginning of the book of Exodus of the end of Genesis. In fact, that opening, I think 6 or 7 words, is sort of cut and paste from Genesis 46, verse 8. So earlier on in the book, we've got line for line the beginning of Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And so here we have the ancient people of God. This is part 2 of their story, part 2 of God's dealings with his people. Israel was the name given to Jacob. Jacob is the son of Isaac. Isaac, the son of Abraham. These are the forefathers. These are the pillars of that ancient family, the family that God has been dealing with. Abraham was the father of the nation, the man whom God had called out to himself and made these great promises to. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to benefit you. Through you, I'm in fact going to benefit the whole world. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you a land. And I'm going to use you to bless the whole world. And so this is God's ancient people, the children of Israel. And this now is who are in focus as we begin to open this book. It's this family who now reside in Egypt. They're not living in the promised land. They're not living in Canaan. They're living in Egypt. How did they get there? What are they doing there? Well, Moses is going to recap that for us too. Jacob, as an old man, comes to Egypt, bringing the whole family with him. Remember that ancient story of Joseph, the son of Joseph, who Jacob dearly loved, and for a lifetime thought was dead, thought had been ravaged by animals. Well, he's been discovered in Egypt. Though his brothers had betrayed him, God has preserved him. Not just preserved him and protected him and kept him safe, but elevated him to the highest heights of the kingdom of Egypt. He's just underneath Pharaoh, effectively ruling the nation. And he saves the nation from famine and death. And Jacob's sons come and live with Joseph. God's ancient promises to Abraham are already coming true in part, aren't they? As Joseph is a blessing to the nations. He's a blessing to foreign lands and foreign people, as he saves them from death, saves them from starvation. So again, that's the context, that's the beginning of the stories of this ancient people. They all come, 70 persons in all. Here they are, a handful, a village full of people, God's ancient people brought to Egypt. And despite all appearances, God has protected. It appeared to Jacob that God hadn't protected Joseph, that he'd let him be killed by animals. But God was actually using him, prospering him elsewhere, protecting him and preserving him. Despite the context of famine, God had provided. Thanks to Joseph, Egypt had plenty. Thanks to Joseph, this family of Israel were fed, starved, and maintained. And so this is another pointer back to the old story. As Moses begins his introduction, he's reminding us of this setting, reminding us of this important background of God's purposes through the ups and downs of Joseph's life. That God was sovereign over all of it. God was in control, bringing about his purposes. But that's not all. There's also language which rings in the ear. If you've read Genesis, particularly the early few chapters of Genesis, there'd be language, words that you'd hear and you think, well, that sounds familiar. The language is language like being fruitful, multiplying, filling. We've got that language in Exodus. It's describing the children of Israel, describing them growing as a nation, getting bigger, getting stronger, filling the land. But that's the language that we've heard earlier, particularly in the early chapters of Genesis. In the creation story, on day 5, God says to the creatures of the sea and sky, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." God is creating this world. He's bringing it into being, and to the creatures in the spheres of water and in the sphere of the sky, he says, multiply. I've put you in a big space. Now fill it up. Multiply. Be fruitful. Increase. Fill. And then on day 6, a similar instruction comes to mankind with a little bit more added on. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Which is given to you. This earth, this world, this space that I've created for you is given to you. So multiply. Fill it. Subdue it. This mandate, this creation mandate, is given again to Noah later on in the story. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it. So we've got here Moses using Genesis language. Moses using creation language. He's speaking of God's good creative purposes. It's his goodness that he wants to see expand and grow and be fruitful and fill the world. Who are God's people? Well, they're meant to be his image bearers, people who reflect him and show him to this world. And God wants those types of people to fill and to prosper and to subdue, to multiply, spreading with them God's goodness and likeness through the whole of creation. Here's our task. Here's our purpose. Here's our point as human beings, as God's creatures, to make much of God in our lives. For our lives to, in their very essence, to be about God, for him, for his glory, to build for God, to design for God, to teach and shape, to disciple, to parent, to do everything for God, to honor him and glorify him, to show his goodness and likeness in this world. Be fruitful, multiply, increase in number, fill the earth. And so that's Genesis language, and here then it's picked up, isn't it, in Exodus. Have a look at verse 7. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. This language of multiplication, this language of increasing, this language of fruitfulness and filling up. They're in a foreign land. They're in a different place. It doesn't matter. They're God's people, and so they're prospering. God's creative purposes, even here in Egypt, are being fulfilled. His people are being fruitful. They're growing. They began as a small family, didn't they? 70 persons. You might think that's quite a big family, but it's not a nation, is it? It's not anything to be intimidated by. If you were Pharaoh with your army and your chariots, you're not particularly scared of 70 people rocking up. They were 70 people, but now they fill the land. How? Well, God has grown them. He's multiplied them. In that time period, it would seem that Egypt hasn't grown at an anywhere comparable rate. God has made them a nation. So that's the ancient people that we're being introduced to, the ancient people that we're being reminded of. Well, what on any of that got to do with me? I don't care. Ancient people. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, children of Israel, the story of Moses. Who cares? Before we get to you, we need to ask who the God is at the center of this story. And so far, all we've learned and gathered really is that he is the creator God, the God who made us. He's our originator, the one who has designed us and made us and given us purpose, the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. This God has placed us, put us on earth with a reason to fill with his goodness and glory. That's why we're here. That's why you're on planet Earth, to know him and to reflect him and to have a relationship with him. That's why you're wired as you are. To be building the type of world that he longs for and that he desires and that he one day will bring into fruition. So what has this got to do with me? Well, it's got everything to do with you. Whether you like it or not, whether you think it's relevant or not, it's got everything to do with you, because you, in this creaturely sense, belong to this God. You are his. He has made you. Everything about your life belongs to him. He has authority over it. He is sovereign over it. He says when it began, and he says when it'll end. And he'll judge you for what happens in between those two dates. And so the great question is, do you belong to him? Are you obedient to him? Are you working with him and for him? Or are you working without him and against him? So that's an ancient family. Chapter 1 doesn't leave us there. Verse 8, the story gets a bit more developed, and we see a new king. Next, we're going to look at someone who is definitely not working with God. We were just saying that we're meant to be working with God. God has created us to be creative, to be like him, to fill the world like he's been filling the world, to be busy like he's been busy, to be active and creative like he is active and creative. But here is certainly one who is not working with God, but working without him and against him. Well, do you remember the story of Joseph? Well, this guy didn't. This guy didn't remember the story of Joseph. Either he was taught it and forgot it, or was never taught it, or has chosen to be ignorant of it, not living in the light of that ancient story. He's just not interested. He has no loyalty to the Israelites. As he leads this nation, he's forgetting all that God has done through Joseph, the rescue and the saving of the people, the feeding of the nations. Egypt became rich because of Joseph, became prosperous because of him, as different people would bring their treasures to buy food from all that Joseph had managed to store up. And rather now than a blessing, he sees Israel as a threat. He sees them as troublemakers. Rather than a friend, a neighbor who's come and benefited you and looked after you and helped you, he sees them as a rival and as an enemy. Notice how his treatment from sort of around verse 9 all the way down to verse 22, how his treatment of Israel gets from bad to worse. At verse 9, he talks about shrewd dealings. At verse 10, that is, shrewd dealings. So he's communicating with his people. He's speaking to his people. Before he goes and is actively against Israel, he starts this sort of propaganda ministry. He starts sending these messages through to his people, telling people what you should think about Israel. A bit of a master dictator. Before he actually does the evil thing or gets them to do the evil thing, he gets the message in. He gets people in their own hearts and in their own minds to turn against Israel. Have you seen how big they're getting? Have you seen how strong they're getting? Have you seen how numerous they're getting? Don't you think they're troublemakers? What if they turned on us? What if they took up spears and knives? What if they went to war with us? And he's turned a gift of God into a threat. He's turned a blessing of God into a curse. He's telling lies, isn't he? He's turning things upside down. I don't know if there's an actual link there, but it seemed to me that there was something in him saying, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them." It reminded me a little bit of the serpent in the gardens, dealing craftily, being crafty in his dealings with Adam and Eve. He's working against God. He's not using truth. He's using lies. In verse 11, this is worked out then in society broadly. The leader says we're not to trust these people. These people are an enemy. And the people respond with hard labor. They put this great nation to work. You're going to work for us. You're going to benefit us. In verse 12, we have a quick aside to say it's not really working. Despite these efforts of hard labor and intensity, it's not working. It's not doing what Pharaoh wants it to do. Verse 13, it's all stepped up a little bit. There's a ruthlessness is the language that we have in verse 13. He's going to be ruthless with them now in making them slaves. Not just putting them to hard labor, not just making them work hard, but enslaving them. Ramping up the authority. Ramping up the humiliation of this nation. And it gets worse. In verse 16, we have the beginnings of ethnic cleansing as the midwives are encouraged to kill the male children, or commanded to kill the male children. Let the female children live. We can marry them, and they can become part of our Egyptian culture. They can become part of our Egyptian nation. We'll bring them in. We'll make them like us. But the men we'll get rid of, and without any men, they won't have any fighting men. Without any men, they won't have any fathers. Cleanse the nation. Let's rid Egypt of Israel. In verse 20, we're given another one of these asides, which tells us it's not really working. Despite all of the effort, despite all of the attention, despite all of the deplorable behavior, it's not working. And then verse 22, this ethnic cleansing, because the midwives haven't really fitted into his plan, becomes a sort of national activity. Right? Everyone hands to the pump. I can't get the midwives on board, so we're all going to do it. If you see a Hebrew boy born, throw him in the Nile. We're all in this together, preserving Egypt. What is happening here? Here we enter into the suffering of God's ancient people. We were just saying that they were a blessed people. We were just saying they were a chosen people. And now we're right in the midst of the dark days of slavery. Just imagine for a second that you're in one of those families. You're told these ancient stories of how God chose Abraham and made his promises to him. And those promises were passed on to Isaac and then to Jacob and these 12 tribes. You know which tribe you belong to. Those names in the first few verses of the chapter aren't just random names to you, but that's your tribe. And you wake up day after day under that power, under that authority. belonging to a vicious dictator, someone who fears you and hates you, despises you. Any young children born into your family are at risk of being thrown horrendously into the Nile. Your parents work for cruel taskmasters, and it won't be long before you're working for them too. There's no future. There's no let up. There's no peace. There's no hope. How do you tie what you're seeing every day with these stories that you're hearing? God is with us. God is for us. And that was the challenge of the Israelites in these days. Beneath this horrible activity are the lies of Pharaoh. There's lies rooted in hatred, and those lies seep through into cruel behavior. On top of it, of the daily grind, is this proactive campaign of destruction. Israel will be destroyed. There's a goal in end, not just to wear them out, not just to benefit from them economically, financially, architecturally, not just to get them to build them and make them stuff, but for them to end, for there to be no future for this nation, for the people to be eradicated. Can you see how Pharaoh is not just in opposition to Israel, but he's against all that we saw under that first point, all of the creative presence and power of God. He's working against that. God wants this nation to be fruitful and multiply. And Pharaoh wants to keep them in. He doesn't want them to fill up. He wants them to reduce. He doesn't want them to be fruitful. He wants them to die. It's another part of the ancient story that there are those in the world made by and for God, yet rebelling against him. They're in opposition to him. There is a hatred under the surface of God and all that he stands for. It's easy to focus on Pharaoh, but there's enough in the chapter to make us realize that other people, part of the nation of Egypt, were participating in this wickedness. The people follow suit. They believe the lie, and they end up in opposition themselves to God and to his people. How about now? What's any of this got to do with me? Well, again, ask that question, who am I to this God? This God that is being opposed, this God that is being hated, this God that Pharaoh and Egypt are in rebellion against. Have I believed a great lie? As I sit and hear the truths of the gospel, as I hear the Bible explained, am I hearing this is boring, this isn't relevant to me? It's a lie. The delivery might be a bit boring, but the truth isn't. The truth of God's love, the truth of Christ coming to this earth, the truth of his death and his resurrection and his promises for the future, that's not boring. Am I living with or against this God? Another question to ask yourself is, what will God do to an enemy like me? If I dare to stand against him, what deserves to come my way? How will God deal with me? How will he treat me? How is God going to deal with Pharaoh? You know how this story ends up. I'm sure everyone, I think I can see in this room, everyone knows how this story ends up. You know the stupidity, you know the foolishness of Pharaoh in standing up against God. But we do that in our own way, don't we? As we take on these lies and we believe these lies, and as we live in the light of these lies, and we ignore God and his promises and his purposes and his warnings. Who am I to this God? Am I a rebel? Or do I belong to him? Thirdly, finally, the eternal God. If you've been following so far, we've hit something of a problem, something of a mystery. That this ancient people of God, this people that God has called to himself, the ones who God has promised to bless and protect, provide for, well, they're in real trouble. They're in the grip and in the hand of a wicked king who is bloodthirsty and after them, a king who has turned a whole nation against them. And how can these two things be true? How can God's blessed people be suffering cruelty? Why doesn't the God who is bigger and stronger than Pharaoh rescue them, save them, stop it. Now, it's hard for us to perhaps engage with the drama and that tension in chapter 1 because we know what happens next. We know that he does rescue them. We know that he does save them. But there's a long time in Egypt. This nation has had time to grow. Hundreds of years there in trouble. Where is God? Has God forgotten about them? Does he care? Is he listening? And as we think about our struggles, probably on a much smaller scale than the children of Israel, we can ask similar questions. Where's God in my life? Where's he in my strife and my pain and my worries, my anxious thoughts? Where is he? Well, to answer that question, enter in two heroes. The two heroes of Exodus chapter 1. Shipporah and Puah. Two women of faith. They're going to show us where God is. They're going to display him. They're going to make him known. They're going to make him seen and felt. Instructed to murder, they dare to defy Pharaoh and preserve life instead. They put their lives at risk. In the darkness of Egypt, they refused to join in. They refused to go with the flow. The flow is against the Hebrews. The flow is to murder them and to destroy them. The flow is get close to power. Be Egyptian. Be more like the Egyptians. And they refuse to take their place in the line. They refuse to get blood on their hands. They defy Pharaoh. And so what possesses them to do that? What's in their mind? What's in their hearts for them to say, I'm not going to do what Pharaoh says? The person who is bloodthirsty enough, crazy enough, to be killing babies, and they're not scared of him. What possesses them? Faith. These midwives, we're told, feared God. Despite all of the obvious evidence around them of Pharaoh's power and authority. He is the one preaching these lies into society. He is the one behind the enforced slavery and the enforced work that these people have to do. His word goes. Despite all of the evidence that God has left Israel, that he's no longer their protector, that he's no longer their provider, they trust. They hold on. They persevere. They trust that the ancient God, the eternal God, is their God. They believe the ancient stories, and they don't just believe them. They allow those stories to shape who they are. Those ancient stories of God sustaining and protecting and remaining with Joseph through thick and thin. Well, those stories mean that they will fear the same God. Their love for God is deeper than their own love for their lives. And so they're willing to risk their lives. Their fear of God is greater than their fear of Pharaoh, so they defy Pharaoh and fear God. Their knowledge of the eternal God has more impact on their day than their knowledge of who this temporary king is and what he might end up doing to them. And so where is God on this dark day in Israel's history? Exactly where he said he would be. And with my people. Genesis 46, God has spoken. He's spoken to Jacob, I am God, the God of your father. He said, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. What he said to Jacob, he meant for all of the people to hear. I'm taking you in. Go down, Jacob. Take your family down there. I'll bring you out. And what else? I'll be with you. From the going down to the provision of food, to the making you a great nation, I'll be with you throughout. We slip into the trap, don't we, again and again, to weigh up our lives simply and solely about our circumstances, the particular situations that we find ourselves in, that can be hard and difficult, dark even. We make that the only thing that we tell our hearts, the only thing we rehearse in our minds. We go on and on about the individual, precise circumstances that we're in. My circumstances are bad. I need this to change. I need this to change right now. I need this to end. And sometimes we try and link that to our faith, and we think, well, God can change those circumstances, so I'll bring it to him and ask him to do that. And they don't change. And sometimes God doesn't change our circumstances. Sometimes the purposes of the eternal God are not known to us. But to his people, he does promise his presence, his nearness, his steadfast love. And look how he has been with Israel. How has Pharaoh fared in his opposition to Israel? He's failed. He wanted to weaken them, and they're strong. He wanted to curb their numbers, and they fill the land. He's tried to kill them, and he's failed, and they've multiplied. At each turn, the blessing of Yahweh has thwarted him. He's thrown everything he can at this nation, and they've come back stronger. The purposes of destruction have failed. He's brought terror. No doubt he's brought pain and misery to individual families. But as we zoom out, the purposes of God and his promises to this nation, the nation stands. And the promises stand. And the purposes stand. He's not been able to stop what God is doing. Nothing and no one can. And here in chapter 1, that's one of the least dramatic chapters, but we're given a trailer of the whole book. Pharaoh versus Yahweh, the God of Israel. And even in this chapter where God seems somewhat anonymous, he seems to be hidden. Even in a chapter like that, God is wiping the floor with Egypt. With Egypt. He can't lay a finger on Israel. God is limiting his power, restraining his grasp, reining him in. What chance does Pharaoh have when God actually steps into the ring and decides to land that knockout blow? Chapter 1 whispers, no chance. No chance. That whisper is going to get louder and louder through the book. Eventually it'll blow out with trumpets. No chance. You cannot win. You will not win. You will be defeated. And so we can have confidence in this God to save, to rescue, and to redeem, to free us from the enemies of the world, free us from the grip of the lies that we've believed and let seep into our hearts, that we've swallowed hook, line, and sinker. Those lies that have somehow become part of the way that we view ourselves and view the world around us. So for the last time, who am I to this God? Do I stand with him? Like Shiphrah and Puah, regardless of my plight, regardless of my circumstances, I'm going to be faithful. Wait, you want me to trust this God? From this ancient story? You want me to risk it all on him, my future, my dreams, my ambitions, everything I've got lined up for my life? You want me to trust that God? Well, this one chapter introduces the story of redemption, and that story doesn't end with this. It doesn't even end with the children of Israel leaving Egypt. No, it continues on. It builds throughout the Bible. It builds page by page, chapter by chapter, book by book. God's dealings with his people, his promises and purposes, and until one day from this nation of Israel, from the tribe of Judah, Jesus of Nazareth comes to deal ultimately and fully with the opposition to God in this world, in our hearts. He comes as the great Redeemer, the great Savior. We've seen even in this chapter, just spending a short time here, that God can have purposes in the suffering of his people. And that's most explicitly and obviously and clearly seen in the crucifixion of Christ. In that scene which looks like it has no hope, no prospect of goodness, no light to come from that. A man beaten and bruised and bleeding, gasping for his final breath, nailed to a cross, naked, abused by society. And there's our hope. And there's our light. And there's the glory of the gospel. Because in that moment, God is using that suffering. He's using that weakness. He's using that shame to bring about his own purposes. He's using that moment in history to redeem people to himself, to buy them back, that the bloodshed there would wash people like you and me clean. That the weakness that seems to be there is actually power, breaking the grip of sin that sin has in our hearts. That for any who come, conscious of that rebellion we were talking about earlier, conscious of listening and obeying those lies in our own hearts, come and confess that and put our faith in the one who has taken our place. Well, we can become God's children. We can become children of the living God. We can belong to him. His purposes become our purposes. His strength becomes our protection. His presence becomes our joy. It's the same God in this chapter. The same God who is giving himself to his people. Committing himself to his people is seen ultimately in Christ, given for his people. Who am I? Who am I to this God? Ask yourself this afternoon, do I belong to him? Amen.